Marcus Rodriguez thought he was untouchable. 3 tours in Afghanistan, countless successful missions, and a reputation that made grown men step aside when he walked into a room. He was the kind of Navy SEAL who could disarm a bomb with one hand and take down 3 insurgents with the other. But on a quiet Tuesday morning in a San Diego martial arts gym, a college freshman with barely 6 months of training wrapped his arm around Marcus's throat and squeezed until everything went black. What happened next would either destroy a legendary career or create the most remarkable comeback story the military had ever seen. The choice was simple: stay down or prove why they called him Remember Me in the first place. This is the true story of how pride, humility, and an unbreakable spirit transformed a moment of defeat into a lifetime of victory. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete parking lot outside Iron Wolf Martial Arts Academy as Marcus Rodriguez pulled his black pickup truck into the space closest to the entrance. At 32 years old, Marcus carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from surviving 3 combat deployments and earning his place among America's most elite warriors. His broad shoulders filled out his simple gray t-shirt, and his dark eyes held the kind of focus that made people instinctively step aside when he passed. Marcus had been back from his latest deployment for exactly 47 days, and the transition to civilian life was proving more challenging than any mission he'd ever undertaken. The silence of suburban San Diego felt deafening after years of constant vigilance in hostile territory. His wife Sarah had suggested he find a hobby, something to channel his energy and keep his mind occupied while he decided whether to re-enlist or finally hang up his uniform for good. The Martial Arts Academy had caught his attention during one of his many sleepless nights browsing the internet. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu seemed like a natural fit for someone with his background in hand-to-hand combat training. The website promised authentic instruction and real-world applications, phrases that resonated with Marcus's practical mindset. What he hadn't expected was the humbling reality that awaited him inside those walls. Walking through the glass doors, Marcus was immediately struck by the organized chaos of the training floor. Students of all ages and backgrounds moved across the blue mats with varying degrees of skill and coordination. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and the sound of bodies hitting the floor in controlled falls. Near the back of the room, a group of advanced students practiced complex submissions that looked more like human pretzels than anything Marcus recognized from his military training. "You must be Marcus," a voice called out from across the room. Professor Eduardo Santos approached with the fluid movement of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. At 55, Eduardo had spent 4 decades perfecting his craft, and his weathered hands bore the calluses and scars of countless hours on the mat. His Brazilian accent was subtle but unmistakable as he extended his hand in greeting. Marcus shook the offered hand, surprised by the firm grip that spoke to hidden strength beneath Eduardo's unassuming appearance. "Yes, sir. I called yesterday about trying out class." "Ah, yes, the Navy SEAL." Eduardo nodded with a slight smile. "We don't get many military here, but those we do always bring interesting perspectives. Tell me, what experience do you have with grappling arts?" "Some basic stuff in the teams," Marcus replied, his chest swelling slightly with pride. "Combat applications mainly. Nothing fancy, but effective." Eduardo's smile widened, though something in his eyes suggested he'd heard similar words many times before. "Excellent. Tonight we work on fundamentals. Basic positions, essential escapes, simple submissions. Perfect for someone starting their journey." The word journey struck Marcus as unnecessarily dramatic. He wasn't embarking on some mystical quest. He was simply adding another skill set to his already impressive arsenal. But he kept these thoughts to himself as Eduardo led him to the equipment room to borrow a training uniform. The white cotton GI felt strange against his skin, nothing like the tactical gear he was accustomed to wearing. The belt tied around his waist was pure white, marking him as a complete beginner despite years of combat experience. Marcus caught his reflection in the mirror and almost laughed at the irony. Here was a man who had rappelled from helicopters under enemy fire, now dressed like a karate student from an 80s movie. Fundamentals class, gather around, Eduardo called out as students began filtering onto the main training area. Marcus found himself standing among a diverse group that included a teenager who couldn't have weighed more than 140 pounds, a middle-aged accountant with soft hands and a nervous demeanor, and a college student whose lanky frame suggested he spent more time studying than exercising. The warm-up routine was deceptively simple. Basic movements that Eduardo called shrimping and bridging felt awkward and unnatural to Marcus's combat-conditioned body. He was used to explosive movements, quick strikes, and tactical positioning. This slow, methodical approach to movement felt almost meditative in comparison. "Partner up for positional drilling," Eduardo announced after 20 minutes of movement exercises. "We'll start from closed guard position. Bottom person works for submissions or sweeps. Top person focuses on posture and pressure." Marcus found himself paired with Jake Morrison, the college freshman he'd noticed during warm-ups. At 19 years old, Jake studied computer science at UC San Diego and had been training for exactly 6 months. His enthusiasm for the sport was evident in the way he absorbed every word of instruction, taking notes in a worn notebook between drilling sessions. "I'll start on bottom," Jake offered as they settled onto their designated section of mat space. "Just work on maintaining your posture like Professor Santos showed us." The position felt familiar enough to Marcus. He'd trained guard passing in various military contexts, though those scenarios typically involved weapons and far more aggressive tactics. Here, the objective seemed to be controlled pressure rather than overwhelming force. Marcus settled into what he considered a strong position, his hands pressed against Jake's chest as he'd been shown. What happened next would replay in Marcus's mind for months to come. Jake's legs suddenly shifted, creating an angle that Marcus didn't immediately recognize as threatening. Before he could react, thin arms snaked around his neck with surprising speed and precision. Marcus felt the collar of his GI being gripped behind his head, followed by a forearm sliding across his throat with mechanical efficiency. "Tap," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying none of the aggression Marcus associated with combat situations. Marcus tried to pull back, but found his movement restricted by Jake's legs, which had somehow wrapped around his torso like a human straitjacket. The pressure on his neck increased gradually, but relentlessly. Panic began to creep into Marcus's mind as he realized he couldn't break free using any of the techniques he'd learned in military training. "Just tap, man," Jake repeated, his tone almost apologetic. "It's just training." But Marcus couldn't tap. Years of conditioning had trained him never to surrender, never to give up, never to show weakness in the face of adversity. Tapping would mean admitting defeat to a college kid who probably couldn't do 10 proper push-ups. The pressure continued to build, and Marcus's vision began to narrow around the edges. The last thing Marcus remembered was the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, growing louder and more desperate with each passing second. Then, everything went black. When consciousness returned, Marcus found himself lying on his back, staring up at the fluorescent lights of the academy ceiling. Eduardo's concerned face hovered above him, while a small crowd of students had gathered at a respectful distance. The taste of embarrassment filled his mouth, bitter and unfamiliar. "Take your time getting up," Eduardo said gently. "These things happen to everyone when they're learning." Marcus sat up slowly, his pride stinging far worse than his throat. Around him, he could hear whispered conversations and knew that word of the Navy SEAL getting choked unconscious by a college freshman would spread quickly through the academy. Jake stood nearby, his face flushed with embarrassment and concern. "I'm really sorry," Jake said, wringing his hands nervously. "I thought you were going to tap. I held it too long." Marcus climbed to his feet, his legs still slightly unsteady. The rational part of his mind knew that Jake had done nothing wrong, that this was simply part of the learning process Eduardo had mentioned. But the warrior part of his soul, the part that had kept him alive in Afghanistan, screamed that this humiliation could not stand. "It's fine," Marcus managed to say, though his voice carried none of his usual confidence. "Good technique." The rest of the class passed in a blur of awkward drilling and cautious instruction. Marcus went through the motions, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying those few seconds of helplessness over and over again. When Eduardo finally called the end of class, Marcus was among the first ahead for the changing room. As he peeled off the sweat-soaked GI, Marcus caught another glimpse of himself in the mirror. The man looking back at him seemed smaller somehow, diminished. This wasn't how his story was supposed to go. Navy SEALs didn't get dominated by college students. Elite warriors didn't pass out from techniques that looked more like hugging than fighting. Walking to his truck in the parking lot, Marcus felt the weight of his own expectations pressing down on his shoulders. Sarah would ask how his first class went, and he'd have to decide between telling the truth or protecting what remained of his pride. The rational choice would be to chalk this up as a learning experience and move on to something more suitable for a man of his background. But as he sat in his truck, staring back at the academy through his windshield, Marcus felt something stirring deep in his chest. It wasn't anger, exactly, though that was certainly part of it. It was something he hadn't felt since his first day of SEAL training, when instructors had broken down everything he thought he knew about himself and forced him to rebuild from scratch. Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway of the academy, his training bag slung over his shoulder as he headed toward a beat-up Honda Civic. The kid had no idea that he'd just changed the trajectory of a Navy SEAL's life. Marcus watched as Jake drove away, probably heading back to his dorm room to study for midterms or play video games with his roommates. Tomorrow, Marcus would have to make a choice. He could file this experience away as an interesting anomaly and find a more conventional outlet for his post-deployment energy. Or he could swallow his pride, return to this place that had exposed his limitations so thoroughly, and learn what it really meant to be a beginner again. The sun was setting behind the California hills as Marcus finally started his truck and pulled out of the parking lot. But even as he drove toward home and the questions he knew Sarah would ask, his mind was already planning his return to Iron Wolf Martial Arts Academy. Some battles, he was beginning to realize, were won not through overwhelming force or tactical superiority, but through the simple courage to keep showing up even after the world had knocked you down. Marcus Rodriguez, the Navy SEAL who had never backed down from a fight, was about to learn the hardest lesson of his military career. Sometimes the most important victory comes from admitting defeat. The drive home from Iron Wolf Academy stretched longer than usual as Marcus navigated the familiar streets of suburban San Diego. Each traffic light seemed to mock him with extra seconds to replay his humiliation, and by the time he pulled into his driveway, the incident had grown into a monster that filled every corner of his mind. The modest two-bedroom house he shared with Sarah looked exactly the same as when he'd left it 2 hours earlier, but Marcus felt like he was returning as a completely different person. Sarah was in the kitchen when he walked through the front door, her auburn hair pulled back in the practical ponytail she wore during her evening study sessions. At 29, she was pursuing her master's degree in social work while working part-time at the local Veterans Assistance Center. Her green eyes immediately picked up on the tension in Marcus's shoulders, a skill she developed during their 5 years of marriage and his multiple deployments. "How was class?" she asked, looking up from the textbooks spread across the kitchen table. Her tone was carefully neutral, the same voice she used when discussing Marcus's nightmares or his growing restlessness since returning from Afghanistan. Marcus paused in the doorway, his training bag still slung over his shoulder. The simple question carried more weight than Sarah could possibly know. How could he explain that a college kid had just shattered every assumption he'd made about his own capabilities? How could he tell the woman who saw him as her protector that he'd been utterly helpless for those crucial seconds? "It was good," he said finally, the lie tasting bitter in his mouth. "Different than I expected." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't press. 6 years of living with a Navy SEAL had taught her when to push for information and when to let silence do the work. Marcus hung his bag by the door and headed for the refrigerator, needing something to do with his hands. "There's leftover lasagna if you're hungry," Sarah offered, returning her attention to her textbook. I ate earlier when you were running late. Marcus hadn't realized he was late until she mentioned it. The drive home had felt both eternal and instantaneous, time distorted by the weight of his thoughts. He pulled out the aluminum container and mechanically began heating it in the microwave, his mind still replaying those final seconds before consciousness slipped away. The truth was that Marcus had never truly been defeated in any physical confrontation that mattered. Sure, he'd lost sparring matches during training, and there had been moments in combat when superior numbers or positioning had forced tactical retreats. But those had all been situations where external factors played a role. This was different. This was one-on-one, skill against skill, and he had been found wanting. The instructor seemed nice, Marcus said, testing the waters of conversation. Professor Santos. Sarah looked up again. You mentioned him yesterday. Marcus nodded, though he realized Sarah was fishing for more information. She had a therapist's instinct for reading people, and his abbreviated responses were probably setting off alarm bells in her trained mind. The microwave beeped, and Marcus pulled out his dinner, using the mundane task as an excuse to avoid eye contact. The lasagna looked and smelled exactly as it should, but his appetite had vanished somewhere between the mat and the parking lot. I think I'm going to shower, he said, abandoning the untouched food on the counter. Marcus! Sarah's voice stopped him at the kitchen doorway. When he turned, her expression had shifted into the gentle but persistent look she used when counseling veterans through difficult transitions. What happened tonight? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond a simple martial arts class. Marcus could see the concern in her eyes, the same worry that had been growing since his return from Afghanistan. She'd been waiting for something like this, some crack in his carefully maintained facade of adjustment. I got choked out by a 19-year-old college student, Marcus said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Sarah blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct admission. Marcus watched her process the information, probably cataloging it alongside all the other signs of his struggle to find his place in civilian life. Was it an accident? She asked. No. Marcus ran a hand through his short-cropped hair. It was a technique, a submission. He asked me to tap out, and I wouldn't, so I went unconscious instead. Why wouldn't you tap out? The question cut straight to the heart of everything Marcus had been wrestling with during the drive home. Why hadn't he tapped out? Pride was the easy answer, but it went deeper than that. Tapping out meant acknowledging that his years of training, his combat experience, his entire identity as an elite warrior meant nothing in this particular context. I don't know, he said, though they both knew that wasn't true. Sarah closed her textbook and gave Marcus her full attention. How do you feel about it now? Like shit, Marcus admitted. Like everything I thought I knew about myself might be wrong. Or maybe like there are things you don't know yet that you could learn. The suggestion hit Marcus like a slap. Sarah had always been good at reframing situations, helping him see past his immediate emotional reactions to find the deeper lessons. But this felt different. This wasn't about learning new information or adapting to changed circumstances. This was about confronting the possibility that his core assumptions about his own capabilities were fundamentally flawed. I've been training to fight since I was 18 years old, Marcus said. I've survived 3 combat deployments. I've killed enemy combatants with my bare hands. How does a college kid with 6 months of training beat me so easily? Because he knows something you don't, Sarah said simply. And now you have the opportunity to learn it too. Marcus stared at his wife, amazed as always by her ability to cut through his emotional turmoil and identify the essential truth of a situation. She was right, of course. Jake Morrison had demonstrated knowledge and skill that Marcus simply didn't possess. The question was whether Marcus's ego could handle the process of acquiring that knowledge. It's not that simple, Marcus protested. I'm not built to be a beginner anymore. I'm too old, too set in my ways. You're 32, not 62, Sarah laughed. And you've reinvented yourself before. Remember when you first decided to become a SEAL? You didn't know anything about that either. The comparison caught Marcus off guard. She was right about his journey to become a Navy SEAL. At 18, fresh out of high school in rural Texas, Marcus had been just another small-town kid with big dreams and no clear path to achieving them. The transformation from civilian to elite warrior had required him to abandon everything he thought he knew about himself and rebuild from the ground up. But this felt different somehow. Back then, he'd been young enough to embrace the unknown, hungry enough to endure any hardship for the chance to prove himself. Now, with a career's worth of achievements behind him, the prospect of starting over as a white belt in a martial art seemed almost insulting. "What if I can't do it?" Marcus asked, the question coming out quieter than he intended. Sarah stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen to where Marcus stood in the doorway. At 5'6", she barely reached his shoulder, but her presence filled the space between them as she placed her hands on his chest. "Then you'll find out that being Marcus Rodriguez is about more than being the toughest guy in the room," she said. "And maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing." Her words carried the weight of observations made over years of marriage. Marcus realized that Sarah had been watching him struggle with the transition from military to civilian life, waiting for him to find something that would challenge him in the way that combat had. Tonight's humiliation might actually be exactly what he needed. "I keep thinking about going back tomorrow," Marcus admitted. "Then you should go back tomorrow. What if the same thing happens again? Then you'll learn something new about how to prevent it." Marcus leaned down and kissed the top of Sarah's head, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. She had a way of making complex emotional situations seem manageable, breaking them down into simple action steps that even a stubborn Navy SEAL could follow. "I love you," he said. "I love you too. Now go shower. You smell like sweat and bruised ego." Marcus laughed despite himself, the first genuine moment of levity he'd felt since walking into Iron Wolf Academy. Sarah's humor had always been one of her most powerful therapeutic tools, helping him find perspective when his own thoughts became too heavy to carry alone. Under the hot spray of the shower, Marcus let his mind wander back to those crucial seconds on the mat. Jake's technique had been flawless, executed with a precision that spoke to hours of careful practice and refinement. There had been no wasted motion, no hesitation, no doubt. The kid had seen an opportunity and taken it with the confidence of someone who understood the mechanics of what he was doing. Marcus, by contrast, had been operating on instinct and muscle memory from a completely different context. His military training had prepared him for scenarios involving weapons, multiple attackers, and life-or-death situations where the objective was to end the fight as quickly as possible. Jake's world of technique and patience was as foreign to Marcus as quantum physics. But here was the thing that kept nagging at Marcus as he stood under the water. Jake's technique had worked, not because of size or strength or aggression, but because of knowledge and skill applied at the right moment. That suggested there was a teachable, learnable system behind what had happened. And if it could be taught, it could be mastered. By the time Marcus emerged from the bathroom, Sarah had retreated to their bedroom with her textbooks. He found her propped up against the headboard, reading glasses perched on her nose as she highlighted passages about trauma-informed therapy. She looked up when he entered, wearing only a towel around his waist. "Feel better?" she asked. Getting there, Marcus sat on the edge of the bed and started getting dressed for sleep. "I think I'm going to call the academy tomorrow and sign up for their regular classes." Sarah smiled without looking up from her textbook. "Good. When's the next class?" "Tomorrow night, I think. Same time. Then, I'll make sure to have dinner ready early, so you're not rushing." The simple statement carried enormous implications. Sarah was not just supporting his decision. She was actively facilitating it. She understood, probably better than Marcus himself, that this challenge might be exactly what he needed to find his footing in civilian life. "What if I'm terrible at it?" Marcus asked, voicing a fear that went deeper than just martial arts. "Then you'll be terrible at it for a while, and then you'll get better," Sarah said, finally, looking up from her book. "That's how learning works. You know this." Marcus nodded, though the knowledge felt different in his bones than in his head. Tomorrow night, he would walk back into Iron Wolf Academy and face Jake Morrison again. This time, he would approach the situation with different expectations and a different mindset. As he settled into bed beside Sarah, Marcus found his thoughts drifting toward the morning. He would call the academy first thing and arrange a membership. He would ask about private lessons to supplement the group classes. He would approach this challenge with the same methodical preparation that had served him well in the military. But underlying all of these practical considerations was a deeper realization that had been growing since the moment he'd regained consciousness on that blue mat. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, Marcus had found something that demanded his complete attention and respect. Jake Morrison and his 6 months of training had accomplished something that 3 tours of combat hadn't. They had shown Marcus that he still had worlds left to conquer. The last thing Marcus remembered before falling asleep was the feeling of Jake's arm around his throat, not as a source of humiliation, but as a reminder that there were still mysteries in the world worth solving. Tomorrow would bring the first step in that solution, and for the first time in months, Marcus Rodriguez was genuinely excited about what morning might bring. Marcus arrived at Iron Wolf Academy 45 minutes early the next evening, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee from the shop next door as he sat his truck and watched the familiar routine of students filtering through the glass doors. The parking lot was busier than the previous night, filled with vehicles ranging from beat-up Honda Civics to pristine BMW sedans. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Marcus was learning, attracted people from every walk of life. The coffee had grown cold in his hands as he wrestled with the decision that had been haunting him since morning. After calling Professor Santos to inquire about membership options, Marcus had spent the day researching the art that had so thoroughly humbled him. The internet was filled with videos of matches that looked nothing like the violence he associated with combat, yet the techniques he watched were undeniably effective. Jake Morrison's Honda pulled into the parking lot at exactly 6:15, the same time as the previous evening. Through his windshield, Marcus watched the young man gather his training bag and water bottle with the casual confidence of someone completely comfortable in his environment. There was no swagger in Jake's movements, no hint of the dominance he'd displayed on the mat. He simply looked like a college student heading to class. Marcus finished his coffee and climbed out of his truck, timing his approach to coincide with Jake's walk toward the entrance. The younger man looked surprised to see him, though whether that surprise was pleasant or concerning wasn't immediately clear. "Hey," Jake said, adjusting his bag strap nervously. "I wasn't sure if you'd be back after last night." "Neither was I," Marcus admitted, "but I've got some things to figure out." Jake nodded as if this made perfect sense. Professor Santos is really good at helping people figure things out. He's got this way of meeting you where you are instead of where he thinks you should be. They walked through the entrance together, and Marcus was struck by how different the academy felt on his second visit. The nervous energy that had accompanied his first class was replaced by something closer to determination, though underneath that lay a current of uncertainty about what he was committing himself to. Professor Santos emerged from his office as they entered, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile when he spotted Marcus. "Ah, you decided to return. This is very good. Most people take much longer to come back after their first lesson in humility." "I'm not most people," Marcus replied, though the words came out less arrogantly than he'd intended. "No, I don't think you are," Santos agreed. "Come, let me show you something before class begins." The professor led Marcus to a wall covered with photographs spanning what appeared to be several decades. The images showed Santos with students of various ages and backgrounds, many wearing different colored belts that Marcus was beginning to understand represented different levels of expertise. Near the center of the display was a photo of Santos as a much younger man, standing beside a slight Brazilian in a simple white GI. "My first instructor," Santos explained, noting the direction of Marcus's gaze. "Helio Gracie, one of the founders of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. When I first met him, I was much like you. Strong, experienced in other fighting arts, very confident in my abilities." Marcus studied the photograph, tried to imagine the weathered professor as a young, arrogant fighter. "What happened when you first trained with him?" Santos laughed, the sound carrying decades of remembered embarrassment. "He was 70 years old, maybe 140 pounds soaking wet. I outweighed him by 50 pounds, and had 15 years of judo experience. I thought I would be gentle with the old man. And he submitted me 17 times in 20 minutes, Santos said matter-of-factly, each time with a different technique. By the end, I was so exhausted I could barely stand, and he was still smiling like he had just finished a pleasant walk in the park. Marcus stared at the photograph, imagining the scene Santos had described. The idea of being submitted 17 times in 20 minutes seemed almost mathematically impossible, yet the professor spoke with the confidence of lived experience. The point, Santos continued, is not that Helio was some kind of superhuman. The point is that he understood leverage and timing and positioning in ways that I had never considered. He had spent 50 years perfecting techniques that I had never seen before. Your friend Jake has been studying these same techniques for 6 months. You have been studying them for 1 day. It doesn't feel like a fair fight, Marcus said. Nothing about jiu-jitsu is fair, Santos replied. That is precisely what makes it so beautiful. A small person can defeat a large person. An old person can defeat a young person. A weak person can defeat a strong person. But only if they understand the art better. Class began with the same warm-up routine Marcus remembered from the previous evening, though his second attempt at the basic movements felt slightly less awkward. His military conditioning served him well during the cardiovascular portions, but the specific mobility exercises required for grappling highlighted flexibility deficits he hadn't known he possessed. When it came time to pair up for drilling, Marcus found himself once again matched with Jake. Professor Santos had apparently decided that this partnership would continue, at least for the immediate future. Marcus suspected the professor was using Jake's success from the previous evening as a teaching tool, though whether the lesson was meant for Marcus or for the younger man remained unclear. We'll work on the same position from yesterday, Jake said as they settled onto their designated mat space. But this time, I'll show you what to look out for so you don't get caught in the same submission. The offer struck Marcus as remarkably generous, considering that Jake had every right to maintain whatever advantage his superior knowledge provided. But as they began drilling, Marcus discovered that Jake's teaching instincts were almost as refined as his technical skills. See how your posture breaks down when you lean forward like that? Jake demonstrated the subtle shift in positioning that had created the opening for his submission. In jiu-jitsu, posture is everything. The moment you lose your structural integrity, you're vulnerable to attacks you can't even see coming. Marcus tried to absorb the information, but found himself struggling with concepts that seemed simultaneously obvious and impossibly complex. Posture, he understood. Structure, he could visualize. But the subtle interplay between pressure and positioning that Jake described felt like trying to learn a new language while blindfolded. It's like chess, Jake continued, adjusting Marcus's hand placement with the patience of an experienced instructor. Every move creates new possibilities and eliminates others. The key is learning to see several moves ahead. How long did it take you to start seeing those moves? Marcus asked. Jake paused to consider the question. Honestly, I'm still learning to see them. But around month 3, things started to click a little bit. The position stopped feeling random and started to make sense as part of a larger system. Marcus filed this information away, using it to calibrate his expectations for his own learning curve. If Jake had needed 3 months to begin understanding the system, Marcus would need to prepare himself for a much longer journey than he'd originally anticipated. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself partnered with several different students, each bringing their own perspective and skill level to the interactions. A purple belt named David, who worked as an accountant during the day, demonstrated a methodical approach to technique that reminded Marcus of his own tactical planning. A blue belt named Maria, barely 5'2" and perhaps 110 pounds, showed him how proper leverage could overcome massive strength advantages. But it was his final partnership of the evening that provided the most significant insight into his new pursuit. Professor Santos called him over during the last 15 minutes of class, gesturing for Marcus to sit across from him on the mat. I want to show you something, Santos said, settling into what Marcus recognized as the bottom position of the guard that had proven so troublesome the night before. Attack me however, You feel natural. Use your instincts. Marcus positioned himself on top, immediately settling into what felt like a strong, stable base. His hands pressed against Santos's chest, his weight distributed in a way that should have prevented any meaningful movement from below. This felt familiar, reminiscent of control positions he'd learned in military training. What happened next defied every assumption Marcus had about leverage and physics. Without any apparent effort, Santos shifted his hips slightly and swept Marcus completely over, reversing their positions so smoothly that Marcus wasn't entirely sure how he'd ended up on the bottom. Before he could process this development, Santos had advanced to a more dominant position and secured what he calmly identified as an Americana submission. "Do you feel the pressure on your shoulder?" Santos asked, applying just enough force to demonstrate the submission without causing actual discomfort. Marcus nodded, amazed by the mechanical efficiency of the hold. His shoulder felt like it was being held in a vice, yet Santos was applying the technique with obvious restraint and control. "This is what your military training cannot teach you," Santos explained as he released the submission and returned to a neutral position. "Your training is designed for scenarios where speed and aggression determine the outcome. Jiu-jitsu is designed for scenarios where patience and precision determine the outcome. So everything I know is useless here?" "Not useless," Santos corrected, "but incomplete. Your conditioning, your mental toughness, your ability to stay calm under pressure, these are all valuable assets. But they must be combined with technical knowledge if you want to be effective." Marcus sat back on his heels, processing the implications of what Santos had just demonstrated. The professor was in his 50s, probably 30 pounds lighter than Marcus, and operating with what appeared to be minimal physical effort. Yet he had completely dominated the exchange from a position that should have favored Marcus's size and strength. "How long does it take to learn this stuff?" Marcus asked. Santos smiled, the expression carrying both warmth and warning. "Jiu-jitsu is not a destination, it is a journey. Some people train for 10 years and never truly understand it. Others begin to grasp the fundamentals in 2 or 3 years of consistent practice. What determines the difference?" "Ego," Santos said simply. "The students who progress quickly are the ones who can accept being submitted by smaller, weaker, less experienced partners without taking it personally. The students who struggle are the ones who need to win every exchange to feel good about themselves." Marcus felt the words like a physical blow, recognizing himself clearly in Santos's description of struggling students. His entire identity had been built around being the toughest person in the room, the one who could handle anything that came his way. The idea of systematically losing to people he should theoretically dominate felt almost existentially threatening. "What if someone's ego is too big to get past?" Marcus asked. "Then they usually quit after a few weeks," Santos replied honestly. "But sometimes, if they're very lucky, the art breaks down their ego completely and rebuilds it in a healthier way." Class ended with students gathering in a circle for what Santos called rolling live sparring, where technique was tested against resistance. Marcus watched nervously as partners faced off across the mat, engaging in what looked like a complex dance of attack and defense. The movements were simultaneously violent and gentle, aggressive and patient. "Not tonight for you," Santos said, noting Marcus's obvious interest. "Come back tomorrow for the fundamentals class. We will work on basic positions until you understand them well enough to safely engage in free sparring." As students began filtering out of the academy, Marcus found himself lingering in the parking lot, reluctant to end an evening that had challenged every assumption he'd made about physical combat. Jake appeared beside his Honda, apparently in no hurry to leave either. "How are you feeling about it?" Jake asked. "Like I don't know anything," Marcus admitted. "Like everything I thought I was good, it doesn't matter here." "That's actually a good sign," Jake said. "The people who think they know everything never learn anything new. The people who realize they don't know anything learn really fast." Marcus studied the younger man, impressed by a wisdom that seemed far beyond his 19 years. "Why are you helping me? You could keep your advantages to yourself." Jake shrugged, unlocking his car door. Professor Santos always says that teaching someone else is the best way to test whether you really understand something yourself. Besides, you seem like you really want to learn, and that's pretty rare. As Jake drove away, Marcus sat in his truck for another 10 minutes, replaying the evening's lessons in his mind. Tomorrow would bring another class, another opportunity to confront his limitations and expand his understanding. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, Marcus had found something that demanded not just his physical presence, but his complete intellectual engagement. The drive home felt different than it had the previous evening. Instead of replaying humiliation, Marcus found himself analyzing technique, trying to understand the mechanical principles behind what he'd experienced. Sarah would ask about his second class, and this time he would have something more substantial to report than simple embarrassment. Marcus Rodriguez, the Navy SEAL who had never backed down from a fight, was beginning to understand that his greatest battle would not be fought against an external enemy, but against the assumptions and limitations he carried within himself. 6 weeks into his Brazilian jiu-jitsu journey, Marcus Rodriguez sat his truck outside Iron Wolf Academy, staring at his hands in the dim glow of the parking lot lights. His knuckles were scraped raw from countless hours of gripping cotton uniforms. His fingers bore the calluses of someone learning to use his hands in entirely new ways, and his ego bore wounds that ran far deeper than any physical discomfort he'd experienced in 3 tours of combat. The problem wasn't that Marcus was struggling to learn. The problem was that he was learning exactly how much he didn't know, and the revelation was threatening to destroy everything he believed about his own capabilities. Every class brought new humiliations as training partners half his size and a fraction of his experience systematically dismantled his attempts to apply technique. Every role left him feeling more confused and incompetent than the one before. Tonight had been particularly brutal. During live sparring, Marcus had been submitted 11 times in 30 minutes by 5 different partners, including twice by a 16-year-old high school student whose wrestling background had given him just enough grappling knowledge to exploit every mistake Marcus made. The final submission had come from a 40-something physical therapist named Carol, who had calmly explained the mechanics of the armbar she was applying as she forced Marcus to tap out or risk injury. "It's all about hip positioning," Carol had said in the same tone she probably used to explain rehabilitation exercises to her patients. "Once I get my hips higher than your shoulder, the leverage makes the submission inevitable regardless of how strong you are." The educational aspect of his defeat somehow made it worse. Marcus was accustomed to losing because his opponents were stronger, faster, or better armed. Being defeated because someone understood physics better than he did felt like a completely different kind of failure. Sarah had stopped asking detailed questions about his training after the 3rd week, when it became clear that Marcus's answers were becoming increasingly short and defensive. She could see the frustration building in the set of his shoulders and the way he attacked household projects with unnecessary aggression after particularly difficult classes. Her therapist's instincts told her that Marcus was approaching some kind of breaking point, but her experience as a military spouse taught her that pushing him to talk before he was ready would only make things worse. Professor Santos had begun paying closer attention to Marcus during classes, offering technical corrections with increasing frequency and occasionally pulling him aside for individual instruction. The extra attention was clearly meant to be helpful, but it served mainly to highlight how far behind Marcus was falling compared to other students who had started around the same time. "Your technique is improving," Santos had told him after a particularly frustrating drilling session. "But you're still trying to use strength to compensate for timing. In jiu-jitsu, timing beats strength. Leverage beats strength. Technique beats strength." Marcus understood the words intellectually, but translating that understanding into physical application felt impossible. His muscle memory was programmed for explosive, decisive action. The subtle, patient approach that jiu-jitsu required felt unnatural to every instinct he'd developed over 14 years of military service. The drive home from tonight's class had been filled with an internal argument that was becoming depressingly familiar. The rational part of Marcus's mind understood that 6 weeks was nothing in the context of learning a complex martial art. Jake Morrison had been quick to remind him that most people didn't begin to feel competent until their second year of training, and even then, only in comparison to newer students. But the warrior part of Marcus's psyche, the part that had kept him alive in Afghanistan and gotten him through SEAL training, couldn't accept the reality of sustained incompetence. That part of his mind whispered that he was too old, too set in his ways, too proud to reinvent himself as a beginner in anything. That part suggested it might be time to quit while he still had some dignity remaining. Marcus was so lost in these thoughts that he almost missed the figure sitting on the curb outside his house. It wasn't until he'd pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine that he recognized Jake Morrison, still wearing his training clothes and looking like he'd been waiting for some time. "Jake!" Marcus climbed out of his truck, genuinely surprised to see his training partner outside his home. "What are you doing here?" "Figured you might want to talk," Jake said, standing up and brushing dirt off his shorts. "You looked pretty frustrated when you left class tonight." Marcus studied the younger man, trying to understand what had motivated this unexpected visit. In 6 weeks of training together, their relationship had remained cordial but professional. Jake was always helpful and encouraging, but they hadn't developed the kind of friendship that typically involve house calls. "How do you know where I live?" "Ask Professor Santos," Jake admitted. "He's worried about you." "We all are, actually." The idea that his struggles were obvious enough to generate concern among his training partners added another layer of embarrassment to Marcus's already wounded pride. He thought he was hiding his frustration better than apparently he was. "I'm fine," Marcus said, the automatic response of someone who had spent years projecting strength regardless of how he actually felt. Jake nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "Mind if we sit on your porch for a few minutes? I've got something I want to show you." Against his better judgment, Marcus led Jake to the small front porch of his house. Sarah was visible through the living room window, studying at the kitchen table with her usual focus and discipline. She glanced up when they sat down, gave a small wave, and returned to her books without obvious curiosity about why Marcus had brought home a training partner. "Professor Santos told me about your military background," Jake said, pulling out his phone and scrolling through what appeared to be a video collection. "Special forces, multiple deployments, the whole thing." "That's pretty impressive." Marcus didn't respond, unsure where this conversation was heading. Jake found whatever he was looking for on his phone and handed it to Marcus, the screen showing a pause video that appeared to be some kind of martial arts demonstration. "Press play," Jake instructed. The video showed a middle-aged man in a white GI, unremarkable in appearance except for the black belt tied around his waist. His opponent was clearly younger and significantly larger, with the kind of muscular development that suggested serious athletic training. The setting appeared to be a competition of some kind, based on the formal atmosphere and the presence of referees. What Marcus watched next defied everything he thought he knew about physical confrontation. The larger man attacked aggressively, using his size and strength advantages to establish what looked like a dominant position. For the first minute of the match, he appeared to be winning easily, controlling his smaller opponent with raw power and athletic ability. Marcus found himself mentally siding with a larger competitor, recognizing something familiar in his approach to the fight. Then something shifted. The smaller man made a subtle adjustment to his positioning, creating an angle that Marcus couldn't quite follow. Within seconds, the larger competitor found himself defending against a submission attempt that seemed to appear from nowhere. His superior strength became irrelevant as mechanical leverage took over, forcing him to tap out or risk serious injury. "The smaller guy is Rickson Gracie," Jake explained as the video ended. "One of the greatest jiu-jitsu practitioners who ever lived." The big guy was an accomplished wrestler and mixed martial artist who outweighed Rickson by probably 40 pounds. Marcus handed the phone back, still processing what he'd witnessed. "What's your point?" "My point is that 6 months ago, I was the big guy in that video," Jake said. "Strong, athletic, confident that my wrestling background would translate directly to jiu-jitsu. And for the first 2 months, I got absolutely destroyed by everyone in the academy. You never mention that. Because it's embarrassing to admit, Jake laughed. I came from a wrestling program where I was pretty successful. I thought grappling was grappling, you know? Turned out I was completely wrong. Marcus found himself genuinely curious about Jake's story, partly because it was the first time anyone had admitted to struggling with the transition to jiu-jitsu. Most of his training partners seemed to have absorbed the techniques effortlessly, leaving Marcus feeling like the only person who couldn't crack the code. What changed? Marcus asked. I stopped trying to impose my game on everyone else and started learning theirs. Jake said, wrestling taught me to be aggressive and explosive. Jiu-jitsu taught me to be patient and opportunistic. They're almost opposite mindsets, but once I figured out how to switch between them, everything started clicking. How long did that take? About 3 months, Jake admitted. 3 months of getting submitted by people I should have been able to dominate. 3 months of feeling like everything I knew about fighting was wrong. Marcus absorbed this information, comparing Jake's timeline to his own 6-week journey. If Jake had needed 3 months to find his footing, maybe Marcus's struggles weren't as pathetic as they felt. Why are you telling me this? Marcus asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment, apparently choosing his words carefully. Because Professor Santos thinks you're about to quit. And because I think you're too good to quit just because it's harder than you expected. I'm not good, Marcus said flatly. I get submitted by teenagers and soccer moms. I can't execute the simplest techniques without screwing them up. I'm not built for this. You're not built for this yet, Jay corrected. But neither was anyone else when they started. The difference is that most people don't have the kind of expectations you're carrying around. Marcus knew Jake was right about his expectations. Every technique he attempted was measured against his own internal standards for performance, standards that had been calibrated by years of military success. The gradual improvement that characterized normal learning felt like failure when compared to the competence he was accustomed to demonstrating. It's not just about the techniques, Marcus said. It's about what this says about everything else I thought I was good at. Jake nodded, as if he'd been waiting for this admission. That's the thing about jiu-jitsu. It forces you to confront the difference between being good at one specific thing and being generally capable. You're incredibly good at being a Navy SEAL. That doesn't automatically make you good at jiu-jitsu. So what's the point? Why struggle with something that exposes all my limitations? Because learning to struggle with something new keeps you from getting trapped in who you used to be, Jake said. Professor Santos talks about this all the time. The people who grow are the people who stay willing to be beginners. Marcus looked out at the quiet suburban street, processing Jake's words. The idea of choosing to remain a beginner, of deliberately putting himself in situations where his competence was constantly questioned, felt almost masochistic. But he couldn't deny that jiu-jitsu had awakened something in him that had been dormant since returning from Afghanistan. What if I'm just too old and stubborn to change? Marcus asked. Then, you'll find out, Jake said simply. But at least you'll find out by trying instead of by quitting. Sarah appeared at the front door, apparently having finished her studying for the evening. She looked between Marcus and Jake with the kind of curiosity that comes from recognizing an important conversation when she sees one. Everything okay out here? She asked. Yeah, Marcus said, standing up from the porch steps. Jake was just giving me some perspective on my training. Sarah smiled at Jake with genuine warmth. Well, any friend of Marcus's is welcome here. Would you like some coffee or something to drink? Thanks, but I should get going, Jake said, also standing. Early class tomorrow morning. As Jake walked toward his car, he paused and turned back to Marcus. For what it's worth, I think you're better than you realize. You just need to stop comparing yourself to who you used to be and start focusing on who you're becoming. Marcus watched Jake drive away, his words echoing in the quiet evening air. The conversation had reframed his struggles in a way that made them feel less like personal failures and more like natural parts of a difficult but worthwhile process. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt something other than frustration about his jiu-jitsu journey. Good kid, Sarah observed, settling beside Marcus on the porch steps. Yeah, he is, Marcus agreed. Wise beyond his years. Want to talk about what you two discuss? Marcus considered the question, weighing his usual reluctance to discuss his struggles against the relief he felt from Jake's unexpected perspective. Maybe it was time to let Sarah in on what he'd been wrestling with, both on and off the mat. "I've been thinking about quitting," Marcus admitted. Sarah nodded, as if this wasn't surprising news. "What's stopping you?" "I'm not sure yet," Marcus said honestly. "But I think I want to find out." 18 months after that humbling first night at Iron Wolf Academy, Marcus Rodriguez stood at the edge of the competition mat at the San Diego Open, adjusting his blue belt for what felt like the 100th time in the past hour. The arena buzzed with the controlled chaos of a major Brazilian jiu-jitsu tournament, filled with competitors ranging from nervous white belts to seasoned black belts who moved with the fluid confidence that Marcus had spent the better part of 2 years learning to recognize and respect. Sarah sat in the bleachers, wearing a t-shirt with Team Iron Wolf printed across the front and holding a sign that read, "Remember me," in bold letters. The nickname had stuck after Marcus's transformation became legendary within their academy, though now it carried entirely different connotations than it had during his military service. These days, "Remember me" referred to the quiet intensity Marcus brought to every training session and the systematic way he had rebuilt his understanding of physical combat from the ground up. Professor Santos stood nearby, his weathered hands resting on the shoulders of several students from their academy who were competing that day. At 60, he had seen hundreds of students make the journey from complete beginner to competent practitioner, but Marcus's transformation had been particularly satisfying to witness. Not because of the speed of his progress, but because of the completeness of his evolution from someone who relied solely on physical attributes to someone who had learned to think 3 moves ahead. "Nervous?" Jake Morrison asked, appearing beside Marcus with his own blue belt tied around his waist. At 21, Jake had continued training consistently since that first encounter, and had become one of Marcus's closest friends both on and off the mat. Their partnership had evolved from teacher and student to something more like brothers in arms, united by the humbling nature of their shared pursuit. "Terrified," Marcus admitted, watching the matches currently underway on the various competition mats. "But the good kind of terrified." Jake nodded with understanding. Competition nerves were a universal experience in jiu-jitsu, affecting everyone from first-time competitors to world champions. The difference was learning to channel that nervous energy into focus rather than letting it become paralysis. The journey from that embarrassing first class to standing at the edge of his first competition had been anything but linear. Marcus had indeed almost quit after Jake's visit to his house, coming within 24 hours of canceling his membership and retreating to more familiar forms of physical training. What changed his mind was a conversation with Professor Santos that had stripped away his remaining illusions about what learning jiu-jitsu would require. "You want to know why I think you should continue training here?" Santos had asked during a private lesson Marcus had requested after reaching his lowest point. "Not because you have natural talent, not because you are progressing quickly, but because you are the most coachable student I have taught in 20 years. Coachable." Marcus had been genuinely surprised by this assessment. "I feel like I argue with every piece of instruction you give me." "Arguing is not the same as refusing to listen," Santos had explained. "You question everything because you want to understand it completely. Most students accept technique at face value and try to memorize movements. You deconstruct every position until you understand the mechanical principles behind it." That conversation had marked a turning point in Marcus's approach to training. Instead of trying to rely on his physical attributes or military background, he had begun treating jiu-jitsu like an intellectual puzzle that required patient problem-solving rather than aggressive solutions. The change in mindset had been gradual but transformative. The first real breakthrough had come during month 4, when Marcus successfully executed his first submission against a training partner who wasn't deliberately giving him opportunities to practice. The technique had been a simple armbar, the same submission Carol, the physical therapist, had used on him months earlier, but applying it successfully had felt like solving an equation that had been haunting him for months. "That's it," Professor Santos had said immediately after witnessing the submission. "Do you feel how that was different from all your previous attempts?" Marcus had felt it immediately. Instead of forcing the technique through strength and determination, he had recognized the opportunity when his partner made a specific error in positioning, then applied leverage and timing to create an outcome that felt almost inevitable. For the first time, jiu-jitsu had felt like a science rather than a chaotic struggle. From that point forward, Marcus's progress had accelerated dramatically, not because he suddenly became more athletic or more aggressive, but because he had learned to see the underlying patterns that governed every interaction on the mat. Positions that had once seemed random began to reveal their logical connections. Techniques that had felt impossible began to feel natural when applied at the correct moment. The transformation extended far beyond the physical techniques. Marcus found that the patience and problem-solving skills he was developing in jiu-jitsu began influencing other aspects of his life. His communication with Sarah became more measured and thoughtful. His approach to job searching shifted from aggressive networking to systematic preparation. Even his nightmares from Afghanistan became less frequent as he learned to process stress through the controlled violence of training rather than the uncontrolled violence of memory. Rodriguez, "You're up on mat 3, called a tournament official, checking his clipboard against the competition brackets posted on nearby walls. Marcus's opponent was already warming up at the edge of their designated mat, a stocky man in his early 20s who moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in tournament settings. His academy patches indicated he was from a respected school in Los Angeles, and his warm-up routine suggested several years of serious training experience. "Remember your game plan," Professor Santos said as Marcus began his own warm-up routine. "Stay patient. Look for your opportunities. Don't force anything that isn't there." Marcus nodded, running through the strategic approach they had developed during preparation for this tournament. His game had evolved around controlling distance and timing, using his military-trained patience to wait for opponents to make errors rather than trying to create opportunities through aggression. It was a style that suited his temperament and maximized his strengths while minimizing the athletic disadvantages that came with starting jiu-jitsu in his 30s. The referee called both competitors to the center of the mat, where they shook hands and assumed their starting positions. Marcus felt his heart rate elevate as the official raised his hand to begin the match, but his mind remained clear and focused. 18 months of systematic training had taught him to process adrenaline as information rather than distraction. The match began with a careful dance of grips and positioning as both competitors tested each other's reactions and responses. Marcus's opponent attempted several aggressive takedown attempts, but Marcus had learned to use his opponent's forward momentum against them, staying just out of reach while looking for opportunities to counterattack. 3 minutes into the 6-minute match, Marcus recognized the opening he had been waiting for. His opponent overcommit to a takedown attempt, creating exactly the kind of positional error that Marcus had learned to exploit. Moving with the precision that had become his trademark, Marcus secured an underhook and used his opponent's momentum to execute a perfectly timed hip toss. The takedown earned him 2 points on the scoreboard, but more importantly, it allowed him to establish the top position in his opponent's guard. This was where 18 months of drilling and positional understanding paid dividends. While his opponent worked desperately to create submission opportunities from the bottom, Marcus maintained perfect posture and pressure, neutralizing every attack while systematically advancing his position. With 90 seconds remaining in the match, Marcus achieved the mount position, earning him 4 additional points and putting the outcome largely beyond doubt. His opponent continued to struggle for reversals and submission attempts, but Marcus had learned to be patient in dominant positions, content to control rather than rushing for a submission that might create unnecessary risks. When the referee raised Marcus's hand in victory, the celebration in the Iron Wolf section of the bleachers was immediate and enthusiastic. Sarah was on her feet applauding, tears of pride visible even from the distance of the competition mat. Professor Santos wore the satisfied expression of a teacher whose student had successfully applied years of instruction under pressure. But for Marcus, the moment felt less like triumph and more like validation. Not validation of his athletic ability or competitive instincts, but validation of the learning process that had transformed him from someone who relied purely on physical attributes to someone who could think strategically under pressure. Jake appeared at the edge of the mat as Marcus collected his medal, his face beaming with genuine happiness for his training partner's success. "How does it feel?" Jake asked. Marcus considered the question as they walked toward the bleachers where Sarah and the rest of their academy family waited. How did it feel? It felt like completing a journey that had begun with complete humiliation and ended with something approaching mastery, though he understood now that mastery in jiu-jitsu was a moving target that receded as fast as you approached it. "It feels like a beginning," Marcus said finally. "A beginning of what?" Marcus looked around the tournament venue, taking in the dozens of matches still in progress on mats throughout the arena. Every competitor was engaged in the same fundamental struggle he had been wrestling with for 18 months. The attempt to impose their will on a resisting opponent using nothing more than technique, timing, and understanding. "A beginning of understanding what it means to be a student," Marcus said. That evening, back at Iron Wolf Academy, Marcus found himself staying after regular class to work on techniques with some of the newer students. The white belts who struggled with basic positions reminded him so clearly of himself 18 months earlier that helping them felt like a form of therapy. "The key is not to panic when someone gets a dominant position," Marcus explained to a new student who was wrestling with the same fundamental concepts that had once frustrated Marcus. "Every position has escapes, but you can only find them if you stay calm enough to recognize the opportunities." Professor Santos appeared beside them as Marcus demonstrated a basic guard recovery technique, his weathered face showing the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching the learning cycle perpetuate itself. "You know," Santos said as the new student began practicing the technique, "I think you might have found your calling here." Marcus looked around the academy that had become such a central part of his identity. The blue mats, the photos of champions, and teachers, the smell of sweat and discipline that permeated everything. This place had broken down everything he thought he knew about himself and rebuilt it in a form that felt more honest and more sustainable than anything he had achieved in the military. "I think you might be right," Marcus agreed. As he drove home that night, Marcus's medal sitting on the passenger seat of his truck, he found his thoughts drifting toward the future rather than dwelling on the past. There were purple belt techniques to master, teaching opportunities to explore, and younger students who would benefit from the patience and systematic approach he had learned to value. Sarah was waiting up when he arrived home, her own pride in his achievement evident in the way she immediately wrapped him in a congratulations hug that lasted longer than usual. "So what's next?" she asked as they settled together on the couch. Marcus considered the question, thinking about the white belt students he had worked with that evening and the satisfaction he had felt in helping them avoid some of the mistakes that had cost him so much frustration during his own early training. "I think I want to start teaching," Marcus said. "Professor Santos has been asking me to help with the fundamentals classes." Sarah smiled with the kind of understanding that comes from living with someone long enough to recognize when they have found their true path. "I think that sounds perfect." Marcus Rodriguez, the Navy SEAL who had once believed that physical dominance was the ultimate measure of capability, had learned that true strength came not from the ability to impose your will on others, but from the wisdom to understand when your will was not enough. In learning to submit, he had discovered what it really meant to be unbeatable. The nickname, Remember Me, had taken on a new meaning entirely. Now it represented not the fear he could inspire in his enemies, but the respect he had earned from training partners who had watched him transform struggle into strength, humiliation into humility, and defeat into the deepest kind of victory possible. In the end, Marcus had learned the most important lesson jiu-jitsu had to offer. Sometimes the greatest victory comes not from refusing to tap out, but from knowing exactly when to tap out so you can return to fight another day, wiser and stronger than before.